Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Innovation Foundation for Democracy. Today we're joined by Nkululeko Sibiya, who is a PhD candidate in the Media Studies Department at WITS. So the discussion will be centered around media and democracy and the new formations that it has brought around. Nkululeko, thank you so much for joining us.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I want us to enter this conversation by thinking or reflecting on the idea of old and new medias and the new formations that they've brought around, particularly their impact on democracy and the democratic processes in the continent.
On democratic systems.
Yeah.
I think, Samukelo, what is important is to remember where we come from, right? Just the development of African media systems, those systems developed alongside or under the guidance or the watchful eye of the colonial state. So even when we move into independence and all of that, our media was really designed around what existed, in the colonial states and stuff like that. So we had a media that was very much controlled. Up until recently in South Africa, where we have the constitution and everything, do we have the 3-tier system, which is public broadcasting, private commercial enterprises, and then the community radio, right? That configuration, South Africa becomes a leading sort of country or state in terms of establishing a media that is almost totally free, that survives on statutory regulation as well as self-regulation type of configuration. If you look at the rest of Africa, it's very much different. Mostly media are still state controlled. But when you bring in what I now call new trend media, right, instead of maybe new media per se, we start seeing a very different picture. We start seeing a picture that challenges state power in an unorthodox way. Because remember, if you have a terrain where what we hear, what we see, what we think about is controlled, and to a point now where platforms like this one, are stretching the imagination, are stretching the conversation, the very idea of activism starts changing because you have tools, broadcasting tools embedded in the hands of people who were originally seen as just consumers of this media. People have also become producers. So you're more or less looking at a prod user, somebody who produces and uses the media, as opposed to somebody who's just consuming the media. Yeah. So the landscape has totally changed. We've seen, was it Bali recently, which is outside of
Nepal.
Africa, but what happened? The whole protest and almost the ousting of the state is based on what? Social media, the switching off of social media, which can be seen as part of the new media mix, right? I think we are in a space also where we are now beginning to see that we can't really speak of new and old media, right? I'm busy with my research at the moment. I'm working on anti-migrant mobilization and the use of WhatsApp in that. We just thinking about the analysis of the data that I'm sitting with, we see a movement that is able to, there's a cross-pollination of what you find on what we call traditional media, which is TV, radio, and newspapers. And then you find whatever is being produced here finds its ways into these social media or WhatsApp groups, and inside the WhatsApp groups you see stuff that is produced in there, and it finds its way inside mainstream news outlets. So we are starting to see, even major news outlets, when they release their content, they are releasing content not on traditional media, it's just across the board. So we see traditional media also being part of this mix of of how new media or new trend media work, right? So there's not a total distinction anymore. Like if you watch Zulu news or indigenous language news on SABC, you normally have WhatsApp commentary where people add their WhatsApp comments, which is funny that you don't find it in English news.
Yeah.
But the state has had to readjust in the context of the introduction of new media. So even the way politics is practiced has changed. We find that political parties and entities have their own media sort of houses, or they've had to think about who will control our social media. They broadcast themselves. They no longer wait for mainstream media to broadcast their programs or what they think about.
Yeah.
So we see a total change. I mean, Swaziland itself had to shut down social media, right? Which is not a democratic state, right?
Yeah.
We understand. But we see how social media has also, again, forced the monarchy to operate differently.
Yeah. I actually like the term of the prod user, because I mean, it's such a very interesting concept of these people who are both producers and users of these media platforms. And I think here in South Africa, we observed how WhatsApp became so big in the foundation of these political parties. I mean, the MK party was founded through WhatsApp.
Through WhatsApp. Some of us were watching it from.
Yeah.
We in my study at least, right? The thing is, I don't want to mention the anti-migrant movement, but we know who's the popular anti-migrant movement in the country, right? But when you look at how they operate, right? The social media is critical because it becomes a space where narratives and ideas are contested. It's no longer one way. In fact, in the analysis I was doing this morning, we were looking at how many times they are able to challenge the narrative that you find in the mainstream media, right? So there's no longer a waiting, because these people also, you remember, it's not just this anti-migrant group or organized people. There are individuals who feel the role of citizen journalism.
Yeah.
They pick up the content, say from the Star and whatever, or from SAPC, choose clips, cut them, insert them in their own narrative, and boom, you are seeing some even fashion whatever they broadcast as if it's a proper news, broadcast with all the elements of a television news show.
Yeah, and so what are the dangers of this? Because I mean, in Africa, we usually just accept these positive elements of these things because yes, they are. Because I mean, these new medias do kind of like provide a particular rupture from the previous, and they offer a certain level of subversion of the state control and media control and all of those things. But there is also an artificial intelligence hand here where someone just cut a short clip only to portray a particular part and then drive a particular narrative. And as a result, the whole movement become fueled by those thought and idea or narrative. What are the dangers of this?
It talks to the safety of journalism, of journalism and journalists as well. Safety of journalism in this sense. Journalism operates on a set of professional codes of conduct, right? Ethical behavior that will safeguard people's reputations, people's brands, and all of that stuff. Now, we are then talking about misinformation, disinformation campaigns, and all of that stuff. That's where the danger is, in the sense that if you do not have enough counter narratives, or maybe if we do not set up systems that are fast enough or able to respond to any content that is published by independent people, right? Like right now, there's a big talk about regulation. We need to regulate podcasts after the incident with the colored issue and all of that podcast. There's a speak about how do you regulate podcasts. But this is how I want to think about it. Think about, what do you call this? This celebrity paparazzi journalism.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Politics likes to present itself in a formal way, it's clean and all of that. However, we know that it's not clean, right? And sometimes we need to not see our politicians in that choreographed way. And also, we are aware that you also have a situation where there's this concentrated ownership of media.
Yeah.
Right? Think about e-news, for instance, e-media hub. They are under the HCI, Hoskins Consolidated Incorporated, right? Those guys own a number of things. They are in mining. They are in investments. They are Golden Arrows buses.
They own everything.
Yeah, Tsukosan. So, again, the type of news you start questioning, how much of it or how much of that professional conduct of an ethics of the professional or journalism's professionalism is able to stay immune from what's happening in those companies and the politics.
Yeah.
So yes, there are dangers, right? Where, I mean, the MK, we're still to maybe think about this deeper. Remember during the elections, the MK said the votes were rigged, and the MK used social media to show stolen ballots and all of that stuff. I mean, the fact that they withdrew from court does not mean that they are not continuing to peddle the idea that the elections were lost based on that content.
And those images were never validated.
Yes, they were never validated, right? I think there were issues where it wasn't necessarily, there was some dodgy stuff happening, right, where the police were involved. But that didn't mean or ultimately that the election was stolen. But we see how when a powerful entity like the MK comes up and raises questions using social media. We saw Donald Trump doing that to Ramaphosa and some of the members of his cabinet, right? So the dangers are there. Maybe at an individual level, the dangers are little. But in places like India, we've seen lynchings, people being killed based on misinformation and stuff like that. So there are dangers, but I think regulation might not necessarily be the way to go, right? Because how do you regulate all of these entities? I think we can take some things from how the press self-regulation, or maybe there has to be an idea where we think about those who will get on the mic, get in front of cameras, have to start thinking about ethical behavior. And there's a lesson or a program where people learn about these ethical behaviors that maybe the press have observed over the years, and how those can be self-regulation within the podcast world and all of that stuff. So the dangers exist, but I think we need to deal with them in such a way that if we pick up that something is a lie, or it's misinformation, there has to be a production of counter narratives immediately. And this is where then the big tech companies, for me, have to be brought in, because they seem to be those guys who are controlling big, major capital, but when it comes to the political issues, they sort of wash their hands. They're not there. They're not there. Like, for instance, there were spoof videos of SABC journalists calling for or asking for money and invest. You know, you see an Elon Musk in the video, and then they present the news. They used big journalists, you know, Francis Head.
Oh yes, I saw that. Yeah,
and then it looks like a legitimate news broadcast where she talks about this new investment, and then Elon Musk comes in, blah blah blah. Obviously, to a trained eye, we can see that no, there's no sync with the lips and whatnot. But not all the people are media trained. And the more these systems become fine-tuned and recalibrated, it will become very difficult to tell the truth from friction. So that's why I think there needs to be an establishment of fact checkers, you know, and this is maybe money and investments that can be made by these social media companies who we know are even removing budgets of those moderators, you know, and all of that. So there are dangers, but I think the dangers, as compared to the benefits, we can mitigate them. They're minimal.
I mean, speaking of regulation, that is such a tricky one, which is very tricky, because I mean, we also on a podcast right now, and so asking podcasters to like self-regulate would be harder, particularly in the age where hate speech, racist speech, is being monetized. You know, so there's some monetary gains from actually trending depending whether it's a racist thing or like a homophobic thing. But also there's this also idea where this hate speech is being rebranded as some civil discourse.
Democracy will come with all of these good things, but there are these bad things that come from this system that we are so much working to protect and build. For instance, under a democracy, Elon Musk has all the rights to buy Twitter. But Elon Musk is a racist, self-confessed right-wing guy. There can be claims that he's not a racist and all of that. But then we've seen Twitter come from a really almost digital democratic commons to now this space where it's just sex, a lot of sex and racist MAGA stuff. That you find being promoted and all of that stuff. There is a silencing of the woke group, through algorithms and stuff like that. Right? So under a democratic or democracy, that guy is able to buy whatever he wants to buy. But again, it is under this democracy that allows him to do such things where he can control his platform to do what he wants. Where right-wing ideology is promoted. So I think in the conversation where we talk about media freedom and how this new media space has allowed people to produce and all of that stuff, there are still powerful brokers at Silicon Valley, right? And those places, China is coming up, with TikTok and all of that type of stuff. That's where, for me, those are the new frontiers for these battles of, political battles, ideology, in states. So we need to ask the question about these powerful owners. How do we regulate them, or how do we bring them? There's still a question of, is Facebook a media company or a tech company? Right? Zuckerberg constantly says it's a tech company. But at the end of the day, it deals in content, produces content and all of that stuff. So those are the questions that need to be asked, Self-regulation, I think there needs to be, an organic type of thinking about the responsibility of being in the airwaves, how powerful, broadcasting infrastructure is, especially in today's network world, where you can say something and then depending on how it goes and the algorithms, it can be a viral thing. Those things impact on people's lives and all of that stuff, So I think what needs to happen is that all of those who then start their shows and stuff like that, there needs to be an open conversation, right? Where people who produce media independently start thinking about what's ethical, what's not ethical. And I'm thinking about the press code and stuff like that can be brought in, where people can come and be voluntary signatories to this, that we will uphold A, B, and C. But also we don't want a space that's overly regulated, right? But we have to think about, in as much as we have conversations that liberate people and have changed the space we live in, we have to think about the responsibility to those who we give the content.
Yeah, I'm actually glad that you're mentioning this because I think there needs to be that fine balance, particularly, considering how right now, the whole podcast space is driven by bro culture, where someone think, oh, well, I have a microphone, I can just jump in and say any thing and it will fly. But finding a balance between, and obviously that's also being taking advantage of the idea that you're living in a democratic environment where there's some freedom of speech, and as a result, you can just jump in and say anything that you want without any responsibility. So I think that the idea of a fine balance needs to also come with some responsibility to say that there's repercussions for saying things like this.
But shouldn't we then be thinking about Chantal Mouffe, radical democracy, where it's like, if you think about contestations in any society, some of the contestations are so anti-norm or far from the norm that it's easy to describe them under the rubrics of hate speech, unethical, uncouth. Like, for instance, the anti-migrant discourse, right?
Okay.
The anti-migrant discourse in itself, for instance, being xenophobic is not, we can't say it's not a good thing. It's bad for everyone, right? But if you think about how that discourse operates. Okay, I can talk about it because I'm researching it.
Yeah.
It is that it is operating under two main discourses: human rights discourse and a legal sort of framework, where the idea is to identify, regulate, and eliminate this thing because it has been prejudged to be bad. What that does is that, unfortunately, it starts hiding some of the things that are being fought about in this space. Remember, the issue of migration is political. It's not just a legal human rights matter. There are other things that are then hidden that you can't find. Like, for instance, I do an analysis of about 200 newspapers, right? In those newspapers, yes, and rightfully so, you find where Operation Tutula, the view is that it's a negative thing that has to be eliminated. But what you do not find, for instance, where I go to the WhatsApp, is the fact that Operation Tutula, for instance, is rooted where it's military veterans and members of Umphakathi. Where do these military veterans come from? They don't come from the SANDF. They come from the MK, meaning they are ANC people. And then you start digging, right? And you find all sorts of political contestations that you do not normally find, right? So when we talk about radical democracy, the space for me, when new media comes in, it creates this radical space where some claims that can't be made. I mean, look at self-regulation. Have you ever listened to a radio show where a caller says, hi, this and this happened. I'm not sure if I should mention the company. That's self-regulation. Because you now know that the rules of the radio station say you can't mention a company if it hasn't paid. Even the audience starts behaving like that.
Yeah.
It self-regulates. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up the idea of self-regulation and radical democracy, particularly around the idea of WhatsApp groups. And here I want to go back to the question of the anti-immigration discourse that is going on in WhatsApp group. But first, I want to just say this, that there's nothing as natural in migration. The idea of running to a space of abundance, the idea of running to a space of safety, of jobs, of opportunity. That is natural. What is unnatural is the idea of a nation state. And I think we forget that the nation state just occupy a very short period in the history of humankind.
It's a thing that's eternal. It's almost as if it's been there forever. I mean, South Africa is 1910. But in our minds, it's as if it's an entity that's solid, that's there, can't be changed or anything like that. I mean, the other day we were engaging in conversations about the naming of South Africa, Azania or South Africa and all of that. And then you start, that's when you start seeing that the idea of South Africa is not as solid. America in itself comes from a certain period, you know. But yeah, without getting lost, right? I agree with you that the state is the problem, you know. But again, if you look at an issue like migration, right? How are we supposed to talk about it, right? If, for instance, we now know that social media platforms and those new media configurations or the new trend media configurations have amplified hate speech, have amplified right-wing ideology, have amplified, you know, all of these unpalatable discourses. How are they supposed to be engaged? Because even on mainstream platforms, there's a way you can talk about it, right? That is choreographed and ruled. So the question for me then becomes what do we want to see, right, as the correct way of expressing discontent about something?
Yeah, and And I think here this brings us to another provocation that I want us to think with, because I think we are at the moment where we have to rethink our democracies, whether we are in Malawi, we're in South Africa, we're in Zimbabwe, we're in Kenya, or in Madagascar or in Nepal. There's a need to rethink our democracy. But again, I'm also kind of like scaling back, because I think we are speaking from a particular place where we seem to have lived in a country that had a particular run of a democracy that is now facing a crisis. But the crisis of a democracy in South Africa right now is also a crisis of the national question. And the thing about national questions is that they are bounded. They have to speak within a particular enclosures. And the problem that arises with that is that if we are to rethink democracy, we will have to go beyond the bounded space of borders. And that is where I think the tension is arising from.
And I think maybe you're onto something. Maybe we are then talking about a reformulation of the public or the citizen or the public subject, right? In the sense that South African citizens, by virtue of being networked with the rest of the globe, start thinking themselves outside of the South African thought process. Yes, maybe it's early days and stuff like that, but I think we are seeing where democracy starts becoming not just a national issue. And by the very nature of an interconnected world, we are going to see a different relationship between the citizen and the state. It's going to change. It's going to be transnational. I think it's going to, because issues that are happening in Gaza, for instance, have a way of coming back and connecting to us. I mean, just this weekend, we saw races being cancelled. We saw protests in different places across the globe. And this is not necessarily something that's happened because mainstream media is objective and covering everything. We know, for instance, that companies like CNN and stuff like that have a stance. They report from an Israeli perspective rather than, reporting maybe, say, Al Jazeera, we know where their slant is.
Yeah.
Right? So we know with this discourse of the genocide in Israel, what has happened. Anybody who sees the world or sees Israel as committing genocide is either silenced or put in a corner by these powerful, people who own these media systems.
Yeah.
Now, outside of these media systems, you then have people, organizations coordinating through globally, right? So in the way that states are changing, or companies are all over the show, so too is the way that the citizen is going to change. I think the future, and this is maybe how, it's a theory, maybe it's a wild theory that I'm making, that in the future, the state, the nation state will fall just because of this interconnectedness. I think we're going to see a phase where the issues are not tackled through just the state, the nation state, but at a global level, right? Because also, the more companies become present in every other place globally, the more, globalization solidifies. So too is the character of the subject or the citizen will change.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also thinking here about countries like Kenya, which I think has the largest refugee camps, some of the largest in the world, actually. But this, just like South Africa, there doesn't seem to be a trajectory for citizenship where someone can come in and we say, well, you've been here for so long, and here is a trajectory towards becoming a South African or becoming a Kenyan. And so I think there needs to be a kind of like rethinking of those questions of trajectories towards particular citizenship.
This is where maybe I'll go back to the idea where I said, when we see the problems that or the challenges that these new trend media bring, they are minimal when we look at the benefits. I mean, the African state has been problematic. We to this day we know why the African state has been problematic. What's beautiful about these new trend media in the context of the global South is that people gained independence, but the media were never freed. I mean, if you look at Zimbabwe, you had how many years of independence, but still in the 2000s, you could get a newspaper with Mugabe's face from the first page to the last page, every page with his face and stuff like that, So in our context, being countries formerly deemed third world, up-and-coming countries, the introduction of these technologies has been powerful because it means we jumped certain stages. Some countries in Africa didn't go through the telephone, right? They haven't seen that telephone. It was no phones to cell phones, right? And that for me short circuits and speeds up maybe the liberation that we are thinking about as citizens of the global South, Africa in particular in this case, because of the fact that how many dictatorships have we seen, do we continue to see? So we are looking for, I think what these media are bringing to us is an ability to really challenge power. Of course, I mean, think about Swaziland. The monarchy is powerful, So despite the fact that these media are there, there's still this challenge of the ownership and those who control, and that states themselves can, at an order say, shut down that thing, and then it's shut down. But what we saw with people rising up when these, we also had our moment where there was a shutting down of the signal in Parliament. Bring back the signal. Bring back the signal. That moment for me, I wrote about it and I argued that's the moment you see the solidification of the public space and the importance of it in the South African political space. Because, that day, the state of the nation couldn't move forward without the signal being opened, So I think what we need to think about is not just the broadcast media and covering of political issues and social life or the economy, but it is the use of these technologies in the democratic process as well. It's right? Electronic voting and all of that type of stuff that we have to think about. How do you, right now we're supposed to be having a national dialogue. How are we having that national dialogue? To what extent are new trend media conscripted in this dialogue? It could facilitate it. We saw some years ago, 2013, I think, Trevor Manuel tried this thing. I think he was still the finance minister, where he was engaging different people through social media platforms or through technology. I think he had set up an independent platform. So we need to start seeing, for instance, councillors. Councillors are using media, new trend media. My councillor in Orlando talks to the community through WhatsApp. The community is now organized around the WhatsApp, and then there's the communication with the councillor about the water, about whatever programs that are happening or meetings. So we see that happening. And I think if government were to embrace governments in the global south were to really embrace and think about, like if you have your GCIS, they think about how do we every day use social media. Yes, we can talk about the digital divide, those who do not have access. But then that's when we start thinking about how do we make access possible? Because you and I walk around, if you walk around in Deep Blue, for instance, there's a Nando's. Every time you see people, they are almost stuck to the fence. Why? They are there for their Wi-Fi, right? We start thinking about maybe we need to make Wi-Fi free, right? Because you see that people's everyday life is planned around these tools, right? Even those who are assumed not to have. That's why you find people sticking wherever they can find some Wi-Fi. There have been programs that were tried by people like the current Minister of Electricity when he was the Premier of Pretoria, where free Wi-Fi spots. So government needs to think about how do we incorporate these technologies in promoting democracy, in expanding democracy, and making sure that people have a say. Currently, the normal people don't have a say in council meetings and all of that stuff. You know what I'm saying? So I think if we consider the global south, we can catch up. These new trend media can give us a catch up to what is happening in although leading countries,
Yeah.
That's what I think.
I think I found the idea of the communities arrange these tools very, very interesting, because you have this image. When you're walking around the township, where you'd find a group of people around the building, and you think something is happening. Meanwhile, there's just free Wi-Fi that people are just trying to connect. So this is my final question, and then I can also hear your remarks on this, because you're a PhD candidate in media studies, and I think I wanted to kind of like pose the question on de-Westernizing media theory. And I'm thinking around this. Of course, I know this is a question, and it's kind of like also performing for people interested in those theory methods and in the academy and all of that. But the idea of decolonizing media, particularly when thinking around the questions of democratization and the questions of also of curbing the whole monetization of hate speech, and also what you just spoke about now, which is how your ward councillor uses some of these media tools as a way of kind of like deepening democracy.
The biggest challenge with the decolonial project, or decolonizing, because it's part of that project. De-Westernizing is part of and parcel of decolonizing, is that our contributions, though important and critical, are minute, to such an extent that sometimes when change occurs, we can't see it, and it will be something that is seen way, way, way later. And I'm talking from experience, right? In terms of when we look at maybe how we teach journalism. If you're going to teach, let's say, copywriting, for instance, even journalism, how many books are written in indigenous languages that teach you journalism in an indigenous language in itself? Or that starts then, the language then will start maybe looking at things differently. Of course, it's not like there hasn't been any theorization about what a de-Westernized media looks like. There have been efforts, like Ubuntu journalism is one of those ideas that has been thrown around and played around with, where the media is not, in Ubuntu journalism, the media is not looked at as a watchdog and always pointing out what's wrong with power, because we know that even that watchdog that we have now is checking just political power and is not checking private power, capital power. It's not checking that, because these very systems are owned by those very companies, right? And we know that a healthy state is not just the politics. It has to do with the elites in all their form, in the private sector, commercial companies. You have to think about those powerful people, because they direct the state, right? Yeah. So Ubuntu journalism would suggest that while you are checking the power, you need to then say, how do we then help you, right, achieve your goals, right? So instead of just criticizing, you have to come and say, okay, how do we then come back and say, how do we help you as this publication, right? We saw then in COVID, where newspapers and other outlets start taking up public issues or causes, not just talking about them, but acting, helping citizens get the right information on all of that. So if, for instance, there has to be a total shift in where the media are not just, there for profit. Even those who are in the private space, they need to then have a view of the public good, right? What is the public good? Yes, we can think about, hey, the watchdog, hold power to truth, but what does a newspaper do on a daily basis to help its community, its readers? So I think also the de-Westernization of the media is something that's going to happen organically, especially when you look at the new configuration of the mediascape or the media landscape. If you look at it, the fact that people are self-producing. You've got shows that are in rural KwaZulu-Natal that are talking either about witchcraft. Of course, they're not just talking about umjolo, but they talk about very different things in the community and stuff like that. And I think in that, because, the media have different facets or components, and one of the critical one is the content. People are self-producing, meaning the content in itself is free of, Western thinking or direction. Of course, we have been influenced by the West in major ways. But if you look at the type of content that traditional communities, rural communities are producing, it also tells you that organically we are involved in that process, right? Regulation has to be something that I think we need to move away from going to the UK or what did the BBC do? Copy paste, and then we come back, we paste. I think if that has been done, we need to think about context, right? So regulation responds directly to context, not just what's leading out there. Because here we are with the best constitution, but we still have a society that's the most unequal and. So just copying and pasting policies, maybe you can use them as frameworks, right, to think through. But we have to formulate policy that talks to the communities themselves, their belief systems and all of that stuff, which I think is still lacking if you're looking at African media systems.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining, Nkululeko. That was beautiful. And thank you for joining. Remember to like, to share, and to subscribe.